Hi there everyone, this is Joesephyr, welcome back to my channel, and we're going to be bringing you another deck list today from Opus 4. This one is a Fire and Ice deck that has a lot of interesting tweaks to it that I didn't normally think of, but I actually got this deck list at least inspired by a Japanese deck list that I saw a couple of weeks ago, and I've been testing it since then with my partner, who I've been teaching to play the game so that I can hopefully bring you guys some gameplay footage, and that's hopefully coming soon. I'm just kind of working out all the technical stuff, and then I'm really interested in this kind of deck because I don't often see kind of aggressive ice decks. They're normally quite passive and quite kind of defensive until they go off, but this one in particular, and most variants like it, are very aggressive. So if you want to see the deck list and see how this works out, then stay tuned and keep on watching. Now this deck is quite dramatically different from the one that I saw in Japan, although the ratios are very similar. It's very forward heavy at 30, and you'll see there are some things in here that, you know, maybe given some of the stuff that I said even in the past, look quite odd, but we'll get to it as we come to it. But the first thing I wanted to point out is that my version of this deck is running Zidane. Now a lot of these Fire and Ice decks actually run an FF7 engine more than anything else and run Hero Cloud from the new set, but as many times as I've tried to play that card, I still just don't like it. I know it's good, I know a lot of people have topped with it, but every time I try and run that card, it just does nothing for me. Either I end up with no FF7 forwards that I can kind of capitalize on it with, or they respond and they kill it and then it doesn't work, or they end up, it just doesn't actually gain me much anyway. So I've changed it more to have an FF6 engine than an FF7 one, and then because of that I decided to run Zidane, which is neither FF6 nor 7. And the main reason for that is because this deck is very heavily discard based, and I thought that having a light card that kind of pays for himself very well, and you know, you can either draw a card in order to set yourself up for that perfect Sephiroth play where you end up just bidding their entire hand, or discarding a card. And I think that options in a deck that's as aggressive as this work very well. So for me, Zidane is an include for this. And then I'm going to start straight with the fire ones. We've got 3 copies of Sabin, and Sabin, however you want to pronounce it. He's actually really good. As in 4-drop 8k that protects himself when he comes in or when he attacks. I think that, you know, these cards that have effects when they come in and some other time, either being when they attack or when they die, they tend to be very good. And Sabin is no exception, and he is just a massive threat very quickly. Giving him haste, as this deck is very prone to doing, makes him very threatening very quickly. And then we have 3 copies of Ledna. Now Ledna is a card that looked very odd when we kind of covered Opus 4 when it first came out, but it's actually doing very well. And I think part of the reason for that is that it's a Shulk target, and Shulk has been doing very well since Opus 2. And then Ledna is also a really great party attacker, I've discovered, if you have Sabin on the board. Because if you have Sabin protect somebody else like Tifa, who has haste, and then have Ledna party attack with her, it becomes really difficult for your opponent to want to block it, because neither of your guys are very easy to kill. And I really liked that. I thought that Ledna actually, in testing, performed much stronger than I thought when I read it. And, you know, one of the things I like about FFTCG is the ability to be wrong about these games. As much as it sounds really silly to say, you can read a card and go, oh, this looks terrible, or oh, this looks amazing, and then you play it and it's actually completely the opposite. And things that work for one person don't work for another, and that's really cool. Like I said, that's why I try and cover mentioning the other cards that maybe didn't work for me but could work for you, like a Hero Cloud. And continuing on with the fire forwards, I think 2 copies of Furion do fit very well in this deck, because they fit very well in a lot of fire decks, because they encourage you, or they discourage your opponent from blocking you. Because once they've blocked and they've killed one of your guys, because you're literally just throwing cards at them to try and get damage through, and they block one of your guys, they don't know that you're going to be able to kill them with using a Furion. So therefore I think that it works really well in here, and it's something that people should be bearing in mind with a lot of fire decks. And then we have 2 copies of Hasty Tifa, because haste wins games in this game. Haste is just an extraordinary keyword, and it's the primary function of this deck. So honestly, having Tifa, as well as it being a Shulk target, makes a lot of sense here. And then 2 copies of Edgar. Now this is a card that I haven't seen in a lot of other Fire and Ice decks, and I really like him, actually. I've found that he performs very well. I mean, there aren't many EX bursts in here, so that's kind of not a major play in this deck, but it's still something. But I find that the fact that he dulls to deal something 2000 damage is actually really relevant. It makes him into a pseudo 9k blocker, not to mention the fact that he searches for Sabin, and, you know, and you therefore still have that kind of chain of command of Castalian Emperor Sid, search for Edgar, search for Sabin, because we're not playing Setzer in this build, so you have something very similar. And then as I say, he becomes like a pseudo 9k blocker because he'll block, use his ability in response, and therefore he deals as much damage as an actual 5-drop would. And I really, really like him for that. I think it's really interesting, and he can support other characters at the same time. And then lastly, we have a single copy of Vivi, and we're using the starter deck Vivi here rather than the legendary one. A, he's a lot easier to acquire, and B, he's a Shulk target. And so therefore he just kind of fits into this deck. You want as many Shulk targets as possible if you're going to run her, because when you do get her off, she does so much work, it's crazy. Speaking of Shulk, we're going to be starting with her to round off, or to start off our ice forwards, and she does wonders in this deck. So if you end up getting a Sage, which we'll get to in a little while, who grants haste when it comes into play, you could play Shulk and a Tifa, drop it on turn 1. I mean, it will cost you a lot from your hand, but turn 1 you could get a Shulk and a Tifa and a Sage out. They've binned a card in the hand and they've taken 2 damage. Your opponent's going to have to answer that very, very quickly. So if they don't know what you're playing, you could just get the jump on them pretty damn fast, and it really works. And it's actually a very, very impressive card in general. Like, at any time in the game, she just works. And then 3 copies of Genesis, which, you know, works very, very well if you're playing an FF7 kind of variant of this deck. I'm gone with more FF6, but I chose to run 3 Genesis and 2 Locke instead of the other way around, purely because I think the Genesis's interplay effect is slightly stronger. He's just, everyone knows how good Genesis is at this point. Anyone who's played in a tournament for FFTCG at all since Opus 3 knows that Genesis is very, very good. And this deck is very, very good at giving him haste, which makes him much, much scarier. So definitely 3 copies of Genesis. And then we've got 2 copies of Sephiroth. Now, I mentioned Sephiroth earlier in like setting up that kind of perfect play for him. If he's the last card in your hand when you play him, he is just amazing. Just straight up incredible. Because you end up, if you play, say, Shulk and Tifa and drop a card out of their hand, or Locke, or Genesis, and then play Sephiroth, it can swing the game entirely for you. It just works so well, and the fact that he has first strike as well just is icing on the cake, honestly. He's just very, very good in here. And then we have 2 copies of Locke, and if you give him haste and he actually gets his interplay effect, he can do horrible things very quickly. Because any card that comes in and only wins 2 cards from your opponent's hand and not your own while dealing damage is just powerful. He's an FF6 character, so he can be searched by Gestalian Emperor Sid. He just works, and he's the reason that I kind of wanted to focus more on FF6 than 7. And then you have 2 copies of Vayne, because I think that normally I would run 1 copy of Vayne in ice decks because I'd have access to Devout, and one of the bigger missions in this deck that you'll notice is Devout, because I think that it's a little slow for this deck when it's trying really hard to be really quick. But that being said, there are things like Kanesena that can't be targeted, you know, Night Deleter I've seen in some sort of Night builds and stuff like that. You know, you end up with cards that are difficult for you to get past because you can't target them with things like Red Mage or Shiva. So therefore Vayne works very, very well in getting around those. And then we have 2 copies of Kuja. Kuja is a card that I obviously really, really like as a character, but as a card I've always found him a little on the slow side. Give him haste and it's an entirely different story. He's like devastating if left alone. If you can protect him for the turn or give him haste and him start getting his effects off quickly, he can be absolutely monstrous. But you just have to kind of bear in mind that if you can't get that off and you're kind of playing him, then he might not work for you as well as you'd like. And then he also does make Zidane 1 cheaper as well, so there is that slight interaction. And then 1 copy of Mecha Chocobo, because very similarly to Kuja, Mecha Chocobo is incredible if you give it haste. It's very similar to Angeal Penance in Lightning, except it gets the effect when it attacks and not when it hits. So it gets set that little bit earlier and it gives your opponent a lot less time to respond to him. And it can't be targeted by summons, so there is that. And you know, you have the abilities through Sabin to keep him alive, Red Mage makes it harder to block, Shiva makes it harder to block. You end up with a lot of ways to keep your Mecha Chocobo alive, but 1 copy is probably enough in here because you don't want to delve too heavily into that kind of combo. Now the backups in here are very, very well themed, and there aren't actually that many of them in here. So we're going with 3 copies of Sage. Now, I never liked Sage. I never even looked at it until literally looking at this deck list, and I will leave a link in the description box to the actual deck list that I, drew inspiration from for this deck, so I can't claim complete, privileges and stuff for this deck because it wasn't entirely my idea, but I've adapted it to my own playstyle, and that's what I want to encourage other people to do. Getting back to the Sage though, I honestly never looked at this card until very, very recently. It's actually very, very good in here. If the things that benefit from having haste: Sabin, Edgar at a push, you have Genesis, Sephiroth, Locke. There's so many things that benefit from having haste. Kuja, the list goes on, that it just works very, very well in here. So definitely 3 copies of in here. Just try it and you'll see what I mean. When you read it, it doesn't sound that great, but just try it. And then 2 copies of Red Mage because it goes in every fire deck, and it also aids a lot of the ice cards in this deck, because if you can get attacks off with Kuja, Genesis, Locke, or Mecha Chocobo, your quid's in. You do so many things, like if you can hit your opponent or you can stop your opponent from blocking you, it just works very, very well. And then 2 copies of Selfie, because Selfie's just kind of good. You know, it's like if you all these things that are nasty and you can't get around because you can't target them, just make yourself bigger than them. If you do it to Sephiroth, he's a 9k first striker, and that's friggin' terrifying. Now, as I said earlier, the ice backups in this deck are actually very interesting because they forgo a lot of the more popular ice backups that are played, like Devat. And they're actually just kind of there to be more thematic to what the deck actually does. So Jill Nabas is there purely to kind of make it easier, like continue your momentum swing if you get the hasty attackers quickly, or if you get things like Genesis and Locke going off. It just makes it easier for them to hit you, and therefore you keep that momentum high. And then you have 2 copies of Kazuza, who's actually another card that I didn't really look at all that much until reading this deck list, and has performed very, very well. Even at the early game, you know, you do lose out on it, but so does your opponent, and your opponent isn't ready for it, whereas you can plan around it because it's in your hand at the end of the day. So do bear that in mind. And if you've managed to get your opponent down quickly, or like their hand down to nothing very quickly, and having a Kazuza on the board means that you can just keep it down, and it does very, very well at it. So definitely try this out. And then 2 copies of Gastalian Emperor Sid, because Searcher. We always have to run a Searcher of some description, and there's enough FF6 in here that it's definitely worth running too. And then a single copy of Cannoneer, because similarly to Shiva, whenever I played against this deck, because not only have I tested it myself, but I've played against it a fair amount by giving it to other people, you spend your entire game plan terrified of Shiva. Cannoneer does the same thing, but it allows you to set up at the same time while freezing them as well. So you end up with a much, much bigger push. You can kind of dull and freeze them with a Cannoneer, and then if you've got a Shiva or you draw a Shiva, you're gonna win that game. It's very, very simple. You only want one of it because it's still a 5-cost backup at the end of the day, and it might not be to everybody's taste. But having tried Cannoneer now, I really quite like it. Now the summons and monster, singular, in this deck, again, are all about kind of the theme of the deck, which is dulling cards, discarding them, and giving your guys haste in order to do the 2 aforementioned things. So 3 copies of Belias the Gigas, because giving your guy haste and drawing a card is great. Giving it first strike and 1000 power is just even nicer, but you'll probably find that you're doing it to give them haste and get that first punch through. And then 2 copies of Shiva. Honestly, I've considered running 3 copies of Shiva here instead of the Cannoneer, but I honestly think that having tried it, 2 Shiva and 1 Cannoneer kind of works better. But again, try these things yourself and let me know in the comments below if you think that 3 Shiva should be in here instead, because I'm open to suggestion, and I'm always happy for people to tell me that I'm completely an idiot and I'm wrong. But I really liked 2 Shiva because it can be such a great endgame push. Like, you're generally not going to use it defensively because there's not a lot of defense in this deck anyway, and that is one of its weaknesses. But the offensive push you get with this deck is crazy. And then the single Goblin fulfills very much the same function as Belias, but you can only run 3 Belias, so having a 4th one is kind of nice just to have it, and giving haste and drawing the extra card is very, very nice. Having playtested this deck against a few different things, the only notes that I can really make are that it has a very positive matchup against, funnily enough, the Lightning Wind deck that I posted previously, because it's just that little bit too fast for it, and if it gets that early game discard, you've had it. But I mean, if it's very, very good in the early game. If the longer the game goes on, the weaker this deck becomes, because it means that your opponent can draw answers in order to counter it. So do bear that in mind. That being said, you can just rush your opponent's head off and just do it very, very quickly. It's not the cheapest deck in the world to build because of having things like Genesis and Locke and Sabin. It is quite expensive. That being said, it's very, very rewarding, and it's very, very heavy aggro. So if you know, or you are a player that really enjoys just rush down and like blindly smacking your opponent in the head until they fall over, then this is the deck for you. Anyways, that's it for this deck list. Now, thank you very, very much for watching. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more FFTCG content and other content that I'll be bringing you over the course of the year. And thank you again for watching, and that's it from me. So I'll speak to you guys later. Bye.